Hi, I'm Rasheed Ogunlaru, coach, speaker, and author, and I'm delighted to be here with Patrick Humphries, music journalist. Dare I say, veteran music journalist with over 40 years' experience. And Patrick, it's kind of interesting timing that I'm meeting you now because you've just published a book which is behind you, which I'm wondering if it's reachable. I'd love for you to wave or
Yeah,
just
yeah, the publisher's very good. They send you 6 copies. So I've still got 6 on there. They come in very handy for showing off. Yeah, it came out last week. A company called Great Northern Books. It's 2 years' work, pretty much, in there. Biggest book I've ever done. So I'm very very pleased to be able to have it with me. Yeah, it's
Yeah, and I mean I'm excited about interviewing you today because I love interviewing interesting people, and just for the bit of background for our viewers, I think we met quite recently at a writers kind of group, and part of my background, some people know, is as a singer-songwriter, and I think that at one of those meetings you were talking about this book which was about to be
mm,
published, the With the Beatles book, and of course, who wouldn't be fascinated by the biggest band of all time?
yeah.
So we got talking about that, but so many other things about writing and so on. You've also, as part of your other accolades, as I understand it, you've written a picture, and I can see a picture of them, a biography of another quite a mythical musician, Nick Drake,
Oh,
who
Nick, yes, yes,
as
bless
well.
him, yes, yes. Nick, yes. I was a music journalist, as you say, on the weekly the New Music Express and Melody Maker and Vox magazine and Record Collector over the years. And the first book I wrote was about the folk rock group Fairport Convention 40 years ago, and then Nick Drake's name kept coming up. Musicians who worked with him, this was semi-mythical figure. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. You know, his nobody really knew about him when he was alive. He died in 1974. So
Mm.
I was old-fashioned, you know, Fleet Street, put in door, pre-internet research to find out more about him. And I realized there was a story to be told. He only ever made 3 albums. He died 26 years old. His entire combined global record sales were less than 10,000 copies. So he was a footnote to a footnote, and I found that quite a challenge. And I'm delighted to say that the book came out as the first biography of him. And I was curious last year how many copies it sold. It came out in 1997,
Mm.
and it's worldwide, Kindle, paperback, hardback, American. It sold 57,000 copies.
Wow.
And so I can now call myself a best-selling author, which is very gratifying, and it's all thanks to Nick.
Well, you know what? I mean, Patrick, I love all of that because in this, just few minutes we've been talking so far, isn't it interesting how we've gone from touching on, of course, we're going to come back to it, a group who achieved extraordinary success
Mm.
like we've never seen in their lifetime,
Yeah,
and the opposite of somebody who didn't see any success, really notably.
absolutely. You're right.
You
It's a
know,
fascinating, and funnily enough, there's a moment when they crossed paths. Nick had a great friend from university, and called Paul Wheeler, who was house sitter for John Lennon and Yoko Ono. They had this magnificent mansion in Berkshire, massive places in the Imagine video. And John and Yoko left the UK in 1971, never to return. They went to America to try and find Yoko's daughter and never ever came back to the UK. But Paul was house sitter at Tittenhurst Park, and Nick was a visitor there. And I remember Paul told me John's the Lennon house. I mean, there were gold records and guitars, and his cover from the Sergeant Pepper cover, and Nick, this obscure singer-songwriter. I called him a footnote to a footnote in pop history, walking along these endless corridors where one of the greatest rock stars of his generation and one who would never ever amount to that in his lifetime. Tragically, of course, posthumously, Nick's career
mm.
really took off. One of those. And unlike Jimi Hendrix or Janis Joplin or Jim Morrison, Nick's career only began after he died. I mean, it was
Mm.
only many years later that he was rediscovered, and is rediscovered that it seems to be on a monthly basis. I mean, somebody's always dropping his name. So, but I was very pleased to be part of his revival all those years ago. Yeah.
I mean, Patrick, I mean, there's so much to talk about. I think what I'd love to do, and I already get a sense of, as you're talking, this kind of encyclopedic kind of knowledge, memory, the stories, and so on. Patrick, I think I want to kind of start, if I may, a bit with you and your journey and your story. When did you first decide that you wanted when writing or music and writing to pursue that for a living? Can you just tell us a little bit about when did that fascinating, either with writing or music, when did that first begin?
Yeah, it was the music. I'd always been fascinated in the music. I mean, I grew up and I was born in 1952, so I don't remember Elvis the first time around, but I certainly remember the Beatles. I was 11 in '63, so obviously you got that Beatles tsunami, and then followed their progress throughout the '60s. They really were, them and Bob Dylan really were the soundtrack to the generation. So you know, I was very lucky to grow up in the '60s and get this great music. I was just fascinated where it came from. You know, I got quite early on. I was always interested. You see a song title, and in the brackets underneath it, you see the person who wrote that song,
Mm,
and then you'd start making connections. And then there were the four weekly music papers at the time: New Musical Express, Melody Maker, Record Mirror, Disco Music Echo. But I mean, they were fairly sort of standard pop star. What's your favorite color? I mean, it wasn't very deep. And then Rolling Stone came out in the late '60s, so pop sort of became rock, if you like. And I just got really interested in it. But I mean, leaving school, I couldn't see any way. I had no confidence in me as a well, I'd never done any writing. So, and I
mm,
went into civil service. I was in the Department of Environment for many years. You
mm,
know, pretty happy career. Made many friends there. Lots of interesting jobs. But a vacancy came up on New Musical Express in 1976, and the famous Hip Young Gunslingers Wanted ad appeared. And this would be at a time in music when the Beatles had broken up, but when the Rolling Stones played, or Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd, they were playing these huge auditoria,
mm,
and it was felt that rock and roll was moving further and further away from its roots, and the NME picked up on this. So it was just pre-punk. It was very pressing.
mm,
They got some new writers in. Tony Parsons and Julie Burchill, they took on the staff at NME, and I was taken on as a freelance. So I began writing for NME in the late '70s. Not particularly, I didn't have a great deal of confidence in myself or my ability, but I got offered there was a staff job came up on Melody Maker, so I joined Melody Maker in 1980. I was there for a couple of years on staff, which was a really interesting period, because at that time the record companies just, you know, had so much money. I mean, they you know, disco, new romantic, that people
mm,
buy millions of records. And of course, if you could get your name in one of the weekly music papers, it was a
mm,
real it really helped your career. But then I just didn't find the music particularly interesting. I went freelance in '83,
mhm.
and touch wood, I've sort of just about managed to make a living out of it ever since, one way or another.
I mean, fascinating, because again, as you talk us through that timeline, starting at, you know, the New Musical Express ad in the '76 and the Melody Maker, you joining it in 1980. As you were speaking, I was thought, oh my goodness, this is it's a real golden era in terms of, you know, record and album sales and all of the rest of that, and what's going on in music. But also, I mean, I'd imagine it's really the heyday of music press, isn't it? By the time that you're working,
Yeah, I think I kind of missed out. I think the '70s actually.
right?
The '70s, I think, really the record companies, you know, were selling so many records that they literally could chuck around money to the journalists. And again, the only way that their acts would get publicised was in the weekly music paper. Fleet Street wasn't interested. The Nationals weren't interested in pop music. I mean, if some musician got arrested for drugs or
Right.
for some, you know, disgusting incidents in a nightclub, they might give it, but they weren't taking, you know, pop music, rock music properly, sensibly. So it was down to the music press. So the journalists had this immense, but that was in the '70s. I sort of came in at the end of it. I was lucky. I had 2 years. I really enjoyed it. I
Mm,
again made lots of contacts, colleagues. Um, heard some good music, heard lots of very bad music. But I mean, that was the nature of the
Yeah.
beat, you know.
I mean, on that then, Patrick, I mean, I'm fascinated because so you've told us that first of all that it started with the music. You know, it was, you know, the Elvis thing had already happened, although you would have been around, you know, he would have been around that then, you know, the Beatles thing by the time you're a slightly older boy in your teens, the Beatles stuff is happening. But that wasn't the thing that you necessarily wanted to pursue, became a civil servant, you know, traditional job. What that moment when you saw the ad, that New Musical Express ad, what was it that jumped out that made you feel, okay, this is something that now I want to go for? Can you remember what was going
Oh,
on?
it's a very interesting question. I lacked a lot of confidence. I mean, I think it's worth for my story. I was at Dulwich College. I was at school. My father had been to Dulwich College. Was very insistent that I went there. I went. I had a very I had a very happy time there. But when I just turned 14, like I contracted a cancer, which still affects growing teenage boys. It's sarcoma, and it meant that I lost my left leg in 1966 and to cancer, and it was you know 50-50 if I'd make it through. Well, I survived, I'm delighted to say, but it was very difficult because the NHS and the council, there wasn't any counselling. It was a very difficult period. You know, at that age was a terrible time for it to happen because the hormones were kicking in. But I was learning literally how to walk again at Roehampton. It was a very difficult period, and I found a great release in the music. Not even being able to afford to buy the records, but reading about them in the as I say, in those weekly music papers. So I did get an education through that. Uh,
Mm,
you know, that was one way, but it meant that my confidence, I lacked a lot of confidence because I felt then that it was my disability that defined me,
mm,
that what people saw was someone who was disabled rather than somebody who, you know, was perfectly ordinary, except they had an artificial leg. So that took me a lot of getting over, and I suppose. But it's interesting you asked about that advert. I don't know. I suppose I thought, well, that's, you know, I suppose I'd always seen a career in the civil service.
mm,
This offered an opportunity to escape from that, and I think I took it and I wrote the piece. I wrote was a parody. The enemy in those days, the journalists considered themselves far more important than the musicians they were writing about. So it was a sort of almost parody of their stuff, which they liked and took me on. And then I realized actually, yes, I mean, I could do this. And I'll be perfectly honest. I mean, the stuff I did wasn't great. I mean, I found some of my old cuttings, and I mean, they're not particularly good. But I mean, it's a tremendous discipline when you. And I found this when I joined Melody Maker, and a
mm,
weekly music paper gives you a tremendous discipline because
mm,
you have to fill 52 weeks a year. There's no
mm,
excuse. I mean, you can't say, well, I wasn't feeling particularly inspired that day. It doesn't matter. I mean, you just had to hammer the copy out, do the, you know, you'd news day on Monday, press day on Tuesday, news conference on Wednesday for the next week's issue. So you had Wednesday you tend to go straight down the park. You have Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday to do the interviews, album reviews, single reviews, gig reviews, get them in for the Monday. Then it started all over again. So that was a really strict discipline, which was very good training for me.
I see. So that there's that craft and that honing that craft would have really kicked in and stepped up an extra level when you joined the Melody Maker
Yes,
by
I
the
think
nature.
it did. And then when I started writing books, then again, that takes you a different level. I mean, you know, if you're writing for a weekly paper, you'd be doing maximum, I would think, 2,000 word articles. If you're writing a book, you're looking at minimum probably between 60 and 90,000 words. So it's a big leap.
Mm.
And then again, that's a different discipline.
And what brought that up? I mean, and we'll come back and fill in some of these, you know, and dive deep into some of these themes. But what was it then that made you interested in the writing the books? Is it that you became so fascinated you wanted to really unearth far more about these musicians than one possibly could in an article. What was it that sparked that?
Well, I think it's the music itself. I think you hear this music that just stays with you for your entire life. I mean, you know, in my world, there's the Beatles and Bob Dylan, and they're very evenly balanced, you know.
Mm.
And I was playing Bob Dylan earlier today, and you know, I revere him above all other human beings. I mean, like
Yeah, well, Patrick, I've got to dive in there because I think this is magical what you're saying, because there's a few times today where you talked about music, and there's something about how you've pointed to it that it's, I mean, any of us, I guess, who are in and around music, there's something very powerful and magical about it, isn't there? There's something that it does, and it's really spooky. I never listened to Bob Dylan, but today, this morning, I was listening to Bob Dylan. A Bob Dylan track came up, and then I was looking at a couple of Bob Dylan things, and then I played probably my favorite Bob Dylan song, Lady Lay, and I was just listening to it. I hadn't listened to it for so long, but as a writer and so on. So for me, there's something really magical about what music does and so on. Can I just ask you, Patrick, was the music from quite early on, and you've talked about those early years and the losing leg to cancer at that time, as you say, a teenager, worst possible, when there's never a good time. Worst, but was music for you, was it a solace? Was there something healing about music? What did music mean to you back then?
Well, I think you're right. It's something indefinable in a way. I mean, you hear something. I remember very clearly, and I can't think why I remember because I've got a terrible memory. But I remember hearing Bob Dylan's "Mr. Tambourine Man" in 1965, and I'm convinced I was it was summer holidays. I was having a bath, and it was on my. I heard this coming out of my transistor radio, and I can't think why I remember it with that degree of specificity. Um, and it just haunted me. I've never heard anything like this before, and even now, you know, to hear that song, to dance beneath the diamond sky with one hand waving free, silhouetted by the sea. There's a poetry and a magic to it, I've always been fascinated by how some 24-year-old could conjure up that world, evoke this world. But
Mm.
I think that's the great thing about music. It can create entire galaxies for you,
Mm.
or it can be something that you listen to in the solitude of your bedroom, your bedsit, whatever, and it
Mm.
means something different. And it's indefinable, and but there's a magic chemistry to it.
Isn't
And
there
I
just
tried writing about it, but you'll never get the same. I mean, I've written some things that I'm quite pleased with that I think um, capture the atmosphere of a song or a moment in the song, and I'm very proud of those moments. But they're just fragments. I mean, the song itself is what matters.
And it's amazing, you know, Patrick, as again, as I listen to you and you're talking about Dylan, I'm like, of course, Dylan, Dylan, music writer, Dylan, poetry, words, music. There's this thing, isn't there? We've got words and we've got music, and it's interesting about Dylan. As you were talking about Mr. Tambourine Man, I'm just thinking about a song I first heard in the '80s. I think Dylan song. I think a number of people have covered it, including I think Diana Ross first covered it, "Forever Young," and I was
Yeah,
struck by the lyric. I
yeah.
was just absolutely struck by the
Oh,
absolute.
he was a poet. The Nobel Prize for Literature was not thrown away lightly. I mean, he's a major poet. I mean, he's at his very best. He's in a league of his own, but he can be very bad as well. I mean, you know, I've once said, you know, he's never let me down, and some friends pointed out a number of albums that were in fact
So,
complete car crashes. So I mean, but that's the fallibility. I mean, that's what makes him human, and you just never know you're going to get. I think he's a major artistic figure of the 20th century, and
oh,
God willing, the 21st as well. He's 83 now. He's still touring.
yeah.
He's still a man of mystery. I find that interesting as well. That very little known about him even today, despite all these books. I mean, I've got hundreds of them up there, and we still don't really know about Bob Dylan. So I think there's an air of mystery, that immense talent. But again, it comes back to what you're saying earlier. I mean, you know, well, what you could play me your all-time favorite song,
Mm.
and I'd sit there and go, you know, whatever, you know. But to you, I mean, it's a life-defining moment. Or, you know, but that's a great thing.
Well,
It can,
well, isn't it? And I wonder, you know, Patrick, I guess people who are watching this interview will be amiss of me. One of the things, and I bet you get asked this all the time, is that then begins to lead us to, as a music journalist, and during this time, you being a music journalist, you then get to meet some of these incredible figures, these mythical figures, these great figures. And let's take it back now to, I mean, the book that you've just published with the Beatles. And as I understand it, you met and interviewed three of them. The only one I think that,
yes,
am I right?
John Lennon, unfortunately.
John's the one who's missing, isn't it? Paul,
Yes, yes, yes,
George, and Ringo.
yes.
I want to, before we dive into, I don't know where to even to begin, but can you tell me first of all, I want to go back a bit. When was the first time as a journalist you either in the room or on the phone with a big music star, and how do you feel? Can you remember it?
Sorry, you just cut out a bit there,
Oh
didn't you?
yeah, yeah. Sorry, Patrick. I was just asking. I just want to go a little bit back a little bit before diving back into the book about the Beatles. And I wanted to know, when was the first time that you are either with or on the phone with, as a journalist, one of these big mythical, legendary, you know, a big rock star? Can you remember? And who was it? And how did you feel?
Oh, no. From what I think the first interview I did for Melody Makers with this cult figure called Rocky Erickson, who was completely mad. He looked like Charles Manson. I knew nothing about his work, and he was completely mad. I didn't get much from him. No, I mean, I was lucky. Later on, when I was freelancing for the Nationals, I did get to meet people. The first one I don't remember because you know you were literally thrown in the deep end.
Mm,
If who was around? Were you around that week to go and interview somebody whose work you
mm.
didn't know anything about?
The
On
first big
Tuesday.
name, the first time where you're like, oh my goodness, this is exciting. When was the first time you're really excited, or the first name that you knew that when you told your friends or people you knew that, or your peers were thinking, oh, I'd love to be doing that interview?
Well, I think it would have to be McCartney. I mean, I think I met Paul in 1983. He used to do this event in London called Buddy Holly Week. He owned the rights to the Buddy Holly song
Mm.
catalogue, but would do an event in London, uh, people covering Buddy Holly songs or tribute bands or pictures of Buddy Holly, whatever. It's a big event in the London music calendar, and the PR company I was working for at the time had the McCartney account. I wrote something he liked. He summoned me down to his office in Soho Square,
Was it
and
Paul? Paul asked for
yeah,
you.
yeah,
Wow.
yes, yes.
Wow.
He likes what I'd written, so he wanted to meet me. And I was waiting in the boardroom, and I heard his voice, him and Linda coming up the corridor, and Paul McCartney walks into the room, and you know, you're just overwhelmed. I mean, you know, you can't help but be. I mean, you know, Elvis Costello once said, like Paul McCartney, he's like Buzz Aldrin. I mean, he's been to places and done things you can't even imagine.
Mm.
But you're shaking the hand of the man who wrote, you know, Hey Jude, Yesterday, Here, There, and Everywhere, Lady Madonna, Get, you know, all these songs that are in our DNA. You know, you can't help but be overwhelmed by that. That actual interview was just fairly sort of perfunctory, but I did keep in touch with his manager and went back to do him on a number of occasions. And what I found is when you're interviewing people whose work you really admire, um, it's a problem because what they want to talk about is the album they've just spent a year
Mm.
crafting in some
Mm.
airless, windowless studio. And
Mm.
what you want to talk about is what they did 30, 40 years ago.
Mm.
I mean, that's the balance you have to strike. McCartney was very good at it. He would always he'd be talking up his new album he spent a lot of time on, and then would just say, but funny enough, there's a thing on my new album that reminded me of something I used to do with the Beatles. So you get a little bit of Beatles in.
Mm.
So, but to talk to him and to George and to Ringo, I mean that's 75% the greatest band ever.
Yeah.
And you can't help but just be overwhelmed, you
Yeah.
know, because you literally grew up with them.
Yeah. I mean, maybe that's a lovely segue. And Patrick, tell us a little bit then about the book with the Beatles, because I guess in a way, you know, you were talking about the come on, you just use a phrase about that. It's a huge task. And I'd imagine writing a book now, however many years on, 60 years on, 60, you know, 62 years on, about this astronomically successful group where there's been so much written,
Yes.
so much known, unknown myth, you know,
Yeah, absolutely,
legend.
absolutely.
Tell us, I can imagine that being in a way daunting. Tell us a little bit about the book and what you're wanting to achieve with this book,
Well,
Patrick.
there's a number of things. It's interesting you ask. There's a number of things because, yes, there have been many, many books on the Beatles. There's books about what they ate, where they shop. There've been books by their chauffeurs. There've been books by their hairdressers. You know, there've been literally thousands. I think it's an estimated 6,000 books on the
Wow.
Beatles out there. But there hadn't been a full-length biography for nearly 20 years. And the books on the Beatles that were biographies stopped when they broke up in 1970. And I was fascinated. One of the many interesting things I found about them was that the way that the Beatle brand carried on. This is a band who broke up, you know,
Mm,
over 50 years ago, and yet literally every day you'll find something about the Beatles in
mm,
somewhere, you know. And that was intriguing. Also, I had the interviews from the three surviving Beatles to draw upon, and one particular one I interviewed Paul in the I think late 80s, no, it was early 90s at his home studio. And for some reason, he just wouldn't stop talking about the Beatles. I mean, he just went on and on and on. I thought this is just too good to be true. I didn't
mm,
believe him. He was talking about John, about Sergeant Pepper, about so many elements.
mm,
I thought that needs to be incorporated into a book. I also felt that there was a lot of books written about the Beatles are written by Americans, and they're good books,
mm,
but Americans don't quite get the English class system.
mm,
They don't
mm,
quite get the geographic difference between Liverpool and London. There's a lot of elements. You know, when the Beatles were born, they were born during the war. You know,
mm,
bombs were raised. Liverpool was the second most bombed city in the UK during the war. Um, they grew up on bomb sites. They grew up with rationing. You know, these were Blitz kids. I mean, they really were. And I thought that Englishness had been rather underrated. So there were those elements, and also it's just a fantastic story. I mean, you've got you've got a record that Love Me Do, which is a perfectly nice little record.
mm,
I mean, it's
mm,
not there's nothing wrong with it. But within
mm.
4 years, they're doing Strawberry Fields Forever. Now you've got that arc. You're never going to get.
No,
I'm sorry, Coldplay. You know, I mean, you're just never going to.
no, it's not. And can I just to add, I mean, it's extraordinary. I'm, you know, I'm not the world's biggest Beatles fan, but I absolutely love the Beatles. And I was watching, and it's so funny you should say this. I was watching The Voice just the other day, and somebody had sung this song, and I looked it up. I thought that's a beautiful song, and it was a Beatles song that I hadn't heard.
Yeah.
It was, and you'll probably be able to place it. Temporarily, the title's gone for me. It's on Abbey Road. It's only about a minute
Mm.
59 seconds long. It's a very short song. It's a McCartney song. It's
There's a
called,
lot on the second side. The old LP of Abbey Road was
I
all
think it's
sorts of very
I
short
think it's
songs.
one of the last three numbers. It's a beautiful, I'll come back, I'll look it up. It'll
Yeah.
come through during the course of this. But again, isn't it extraordinary? Just as you say, the arc of the work. I mean, one of the
Well,
things,
I think if I see, I mean, I think that's a very important point. I think that with the Beatles, it's the span of what they did. It's the fact they wrote some of the greatest rockers of all time. They wrote
mm,
some of the most haunting ballads of all time. They
mm,
wrote children's sing-along songs. They wrote, you know, "Over the Dee, Over the Dar," which was,
yeah,
you know, it's quite old-fashioned now. But this was sort of, you know, ska music, which at the time was not really taken that seriously. When the Beatles did it, you know, so there was just this extraordinary variety of music in only 8 years. Their professional recording career was only 8 years,
yeah,
and they went, as I say, this remarkable journey that they undertook. And I think that's one of the well, that's I think that's what gives them their greatness is the music, really. So
well, I mean, just absolutely true. I mean, so, I mean, so you were just sharing with us that, you had these interviews with Paul Paula you met a number of times. Anything you wanted to say about the interviews with Ringo and George? Can you tell us a little bit about them? Did you meet them just once, more than once?
yeah, that was just the one. Ringo was he had this group called the All Star Band, which was lots of 60s and 70s sort of musical relics from the Eagles and Peter Frampton and people that get together. It was a good night out, and he'd sing some Beatles songs and they'd sing some of their hits. And he had a DVD of the All Star Band out, which is what I was to interview him about. But we very quickly got on to what he used to call his other band. And I'd think, oh, that's going to be the Beatles then. I mean, that was his other band. And, the point he made and the point George made as well was, I mean, that was only 8 years of their lives.
Yeah.
They were only in the Beatles. The recording crew was only 8 years. But, of course,
yeah,
carries on and on and on and on in there, and they know they can't get away from it. George was very grumpy. You got him on gardening, Monty Python, Formula One racing, the Ruttles, Bob Dylan. He loved Dylan. He was fine, but as soon as the Beatles came out, you could sense his eyes rolling.
And when was it that you interviewed him? What time frame was it?
1990. He got a double album out live in Japan, and I began by saying, there's a lot of Beatles songs on there. I said, well, I don't think of them as Beatles songs. But they're on Beatle albums. He said, yeah, but they're my songs. I said, yeah, they're your songs, so they appear on Beatle albums. So he got into this sort of pissing contest about what's a Beatles song and what isn't. And I think he always felt that that was just part of his life. And I can understand that, I mean, George was 26 when he left the Beatles. I mean, I don't know what you were like at 26, but I was in the great, and he'd seen the Seven Wonders. He'd been to the top of the world. He was 26 when he left. They were incredibly young. Happened to them. They created this incredible body of music, which carries on today. I mean, I did some research on some Gen Z podcast websites to see if there's still this interest in the Beatles. And there was one quote. Some teenager said, looking at the history of the Beatles, I can't believe this actually happened. Yes, in the world of Simon Cowell and groups that are put together and manufactured TikTok and all that, to think of these four individuals coming together in this remote northern seaport, this rundown northern seaport, and coming down to London and changing the world. I mean, it's an incredible story, And
can you tell us, Patrick, a little bit about, and we'll put below the video a link to where people can order a copy of the book. And I think that there's something exciting, isn't it? They can get a signed copy, and tell us a little bit about.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm very lucky. They're a very good publisher called Great Northern Books. They're very good, and they said, well, can you sign some book plates? And so if somebody orders a copy, then they'll paste the plate in with my signature. And I thought, well, that's not really interesting. But I thought, actually, if I can just think of a line from a Beatles song to include that, then it's a bit of a quiz. They can guess. I mean, the obvious ones. You can quote from Hey Jude and all the number one hit.
You're going to have to throw one at me now to see if I can guess the song. You're going to have to.
Oh, I mean, the one I remember because Paul told me is from Hey Jude. When I was interviewing him, he said, I remember when I was writing Hey Jude, I mean, the hair's on the back of your neck. And he said, and I was playing it to John, and you think, well, that'd be John Lennon then, and he said, and I got to this line, the movement you need is on your shoulder. But he said to John that's always going to be a filler line. And John said, best line in the song, man. And kept it in, so that's a little thing. So you get the movement, somebody's got the movement you need is on your shoulder. And there's all sorts of other old little lines that come. And so many of them are in a way, they're like nursery rhymes. They're like hymns. They're just so much part of your DNA in a way. Like you were saying earlier, you heard a Beatles song, and you didn't know it's by the Beatles.
There's this song. It was just a great song. I was like, my goodness, of all the, I don't know how many there are great songs. That another one had this number of years in, and I hadn't heard this one. How did that happen? Most people are, you get some very successful artists. Hugely successful artists. There are 4 or 5 great songs. That's a huge achievement. I mean, it's like 20, 30. Great song. I mean,
great song. Exactly. I think if I'd been Paul McCartney, and at the age of 24, I'd written Yesterday. I thought, okay, fine, that's it. My work here is done. But he carried on, and indeed, bless him, does carry on still. I mean, I remember I was in Nashville once, and there's a songwriters row. The songwriters in Nashville, the big country and western capital is. They literally clock in at 10 o'clock every morning, knock off at 6, and they're there to write songs. It's a songwriting factory. And this guy I was interviewing, and on the way out, I said, "Well, what's the one song you wish you'd written?" And he stopped and he said, "Under Rigby." And I said, "Yeah, it's a great song." He said, "No, just stop, go home and play it." He said, "It's 2 minutes and 14 seconds. The lyric is unbelievable. The melody is unbelievable. The arrangement is unbelievable. It is absolute perfection." And I went back. I went back. I thought, yeah, he's right. I mean,
And it's funny you should say that, because that was the song that was just going through my mind. I think it's the very first time I remember when I remember hearing it as a teenager, and I think it was the first song of the Beatles that I'd heard that had this deeply profound effect on me. Just the lyric is so extraordinarily beautifully haunting, and everything about it.
yes, yes.
It's just incredible. Um, I mean, Patrick, can you tell us, I mean, maybe just any last thing you want to say about, because I want to get a few more questions in before we wrap up with the book. Have you, let me word it this way. Was there anything in the process of putting the book together? Because it sounds to me you've got interviews, the book spans interviews with them over about 15 years or so, something like that, perhaps. What did you learn anything new about either them or yourself, or about the journey through that whole process of bringing these interviews together? And can you tell us a little bit more about the journey of the book, of how we can experience the book?
I mean, you live with these books. I mean, in this case, it was the best part of 2 years. I'd done a book on the Rolling Stones in 2019, which I was very pleased with. I really enjoyed doing the research, going back to all those yellowing melody makers and NMEs from 50 years ago. And I spoke to a very dear friend of mine, Bill Brook, who went to university in Liverpool in the mid-70s, because that's where the Beatles came from. And the first time I went there was to see Bill. And Liverpool in the mid-70s was very run down. There was one really tragic statue of the Beatles there. Now it's John Lennon Airport and National Trust have got Paul and John's. It's literally completely different. And there's 90 Beatles sites, I think. But I just became fascinated by the story, how these four teenagers came together and made this music, and also how lucky they were to get Brian Epstein as a manager, how lucky they were to get George Martin as a record producer, how lucky they were to have Lennon and McCartney as the prime songwriters. So many elements of it. It is like a fairy story, and I really enjoyed writing it. And of course, the great thing is you just listen to a random, like any Beatles album at random, and there's something great and particularly on shuffle. When I got my iPod years ago, it would go on shuffle, and you'd be used to hearing the songs in the order you'd literally grown up with, and then suddenly, from, so like you were saying earlier, some little 53-second song pops up. You think, oh, that I've forgotten that one. So it's a fantastic experience. And writing a book, I mean, you do immerse yourself in it. You do lose yourself in it, because I'm very lucky. If it's non-fiction, you can always find something to write about. A quote or something will pop up. And in a sense, it's almost like typing. It's like playing the piano. It's like exercising the piano. You can always find something to type in. And once you started typing, I find it's actually quite easy to then progress onto more creative elements of it. So I've been very lucky.
I mean, fascinating. I mean, just before I want to try and see if I can pack in a few more questions before we wrap up. I think, as a music journalist, what was the blend of the work like between interviewing people in person and over the phone? And are there names that we would know of some of the people that you've interviewed, perhaps that you enjoyed interviewing the most? It's interesting, the story that you told about, McCartney actually had requested you following something.
Yes.
Tell us a little about the people who you met, and perhaps people we may know or may know of. We haven't been as lucky as you to be in the same room or to have the conversation with them. Are there artists that come to mind where you think, actually, there's something about that conversation that I really enjoyed, or that was
Yes, yeah,
about them or the
I've been very lucky. You know, I mean, I grew up, as I say, when I was ill in 1966 and 67, recovering. I found great solace in music, and then for example, Simon and Garfunkel. I love Simon and Garfunkel. And
Mm,
at one point in 2001, I went to New York to interview Art Garfunkel because they'd remastered the Simon and Garfunkel catalog for CDs. So he was very happy to talk about that era in his career
mm,
rather than his new solo
mm,
album. And that was fantastic. I mean, talking to someone whose records I'd listened to when I was 14, hearing him talking about those same records and the techniques they used, and when Paul Simon was living here and Art used to fly over, and Simon and Garfunkel used to go busking in Trafalgar Square before they got moved on by the police, you know.
mm,
All these stories, you can't believe how lucky you are. So I've been very, very privileged, and you know, you meet these people whose work has, if not influenced you, you've been aware of for so many years, and you're in the same room the same, and it's very difficult to strike a balance. It's interviewing is quite an unnatural relationship. I mean, you have a very finite amount of time.
mm,
Say, as I said earlier, you know,
mm,
they'll want to what they just done. You want to, and normally the press officer will come in after half an hour saying we're running a bit late, guys. Can you cut it short? You don't.
mm,
Also, you need to really do it face to face. You need to see people's
mm.
expressions. Phone interviews are not very
Yeah,
satisfactory.
yeah. I
But
could
if
imagine, especially given if you do have such a short period of time with somebody for something of that nature, and particularly tying in with as it would have been soft in an album, whatever, getting
yeah,
something of that
yes,
moment.
yes. And
Yeah.
I think, as I say, I keep going how lucky I was. I mean, these days, you know, I get Metro every morning, and I read the, you know, the tabloids, and it seems as though interviews these days, the journalist will be in a hotel room, and it'll be done on a Zoom
Mm,
by you're interviewing the film star or the record star. You
mm,
have 10 minutes to, and there's no element of criticism in the interview. It has to be positive because otherwise
mm,
they'll withdraw their love and the advertising will dry up. You know, it's become very formulaic. It's become very mechanical,
mm,
and I'm sure you know that the fans of I don't know. I mean, the one people have said
mhm,
to me, is there any comparison with the Beatles? And my knee-jerk reaction is yes, Taylor Swift. I think she's extraordinary. I wouldn't know a note of her music if I heard. I've never heard a consciously heard a note of Taylor Swift's music, but I think as a phenomenon, she's absolutely fascinating.
mm.
She can
Yes.
influence presidential elections. She can influence economies, world economies. You know, that to me is real power. You know, her current tour, it'll be the first tour ever that'll gross over $1 billion.
Well,
The Rolling Stones, Paul McCartney, U2, none of them have come close to that.
it is.
So I think she's
It
a
is.
fascinating phenomenon.
And isn't it extraordinary that thing that global impact on music? It's interesting, isn't it? That it makes me think about, I guess, when you're what we've got here is, isn't it? There's something about our fascination with music, our fascination with musicians, them, their stories, the impact that they can have, how somebody we've not met can have a huge impact, the
Yes.
cultural impact way beyond. Was there ever anyone who you wished that you'd got to interview and you didn't, or anyone who you
Well, we've mentioned his name earlier, and the words Bob and Dylan spring to mind. I'd love to just to have met Bob. I think the thing is that he can't remember where these songs came from.
Mm,
He genuinely cannot remember the circumstances, the location, because we're going back 60, in some cases 70 years in his career, which is understandable. I'd love to just to have met him. I'd like to have sat down with Paul Simon, who wrote the Simon and
mm,
Garfunkel
mm,
songs, just because Dylan can't remember anything. Paul Simon's got a very, very good memory.
mm,
So those are the two I'd love to have sat down with. There's still
mm.
time. If they're watching, you know, I'm around. You know,
Exactly. And
Rasheed's got my number. You know, so
Patrick, tell us a little bit about um, moving forward from this. I know that when we've had chats, and it's been always a joy chatting to you and me at the authors group the couple of times we've done that. Um, I'm actually quite excited actually about that, and I don't know how much I can say about it, but the I don't know what you call it, the memoir, the book that you're wanting to write, because I think that
Yes.
there's something about you, your journey, and your story, and I think that you touched on it very briefly, but when you talked about things like, I mean, I can't imagine what it's like having cancer at 14, losing a leg at 14. I certainly know by the time when I was growing up, how our views as a society on disability, it still hasn't improved much now. It was very, very, very poor. It was,
Yes.
it was very, very, I can only imagine that in the 60s, it must have been a very, very, very difficult, a very,
Yes.
very difficult time. Tell us, what are you wanting? How are you approaching this memoir, and what are you wanting to kind of get across? Have you given that some thought? Tell us some
Yeah,
of.
I have. I find that I'm not trivializing mental health issues. People suffer in so many different ways. I kind of think the marketplace has almost had enough of it. A friend of mine did a book about his struggle with mental health. He was doing an event locally. I bought a ticket. It was cancelled, and I said, "Why?" He said, between ourselves, I think people have had enough. But every time they open the newspaper, celebrity sports person is always blaming mental health issues for that kind of thing. And he said, but I think your book about the physical problems that you faced and
Mm,
to this day still face, I think there could be a market for that. So it wasn't done as a commercial thing. I think I needed to address the, I was 14, I'm 72 now. I mean, it's taken a long time to really think about how to, because my life, I can't imagine my life with two legs.
mm,
Um, so it was a really dividing line. It was the line in the sand for my life, my entire life. And I don't do a lot of looking back. On occasion, I will get very bitter and twisted and think, I wonder what would happen if. But you
mm,
can't. But yes, you're absolutely right. Things were very different, quite barbaric back in those days. No
mm,
counselling. My parents weren't allowed to be with me on the night before the operation. It was awful, awful. And I felt that my story. People say, "Oh, you were very brave." Well, I don't think I was particularly. I mean, I think I was 14. I didn't know any better. I mean, a man in the white coat. You looked up to people in authority in those days, and the man in the white coat came and sat on my bed, and he said, "I'm afraid I can't." The conversation, but basically, to I don't even know if he said to save your life. He said, that we believe the best way forward is you'd have to lose your leg and then torn it and I don't remember feeling. I don't remember the
mm,
details. I remember lies at King's College Hospital just over the hill. And I remember just lying there feeling very, very alone and very vulnerable. And it happened, and I lived. I could have died, and I'm eternally grateful for the fact I didn't.
Was
Uh,
it the nature of was it the nature of the cancer? Was it the nature of the procedure that they needed to do? Was it what was that?
it was a particular cancer that affects teenage boys
Right,
still.
right,
And to his eternal credit, Roger Daltrey from The Who has been a patron of Teenage Cancer Trust,
right.
just retired, and I think he's handing it over. Um, it still affects growing teenage boys. It's in the
Mm,
bone. And when I thought I knew, there was no appreciation of what the cause was,
mm,
uh, it was it's very difficult to be specific because, as I say, people in authority, if somebody in a white coat, if a man in a white coat who's a surgeon says this is what we're going to do, and
mm,
obviously with your parents' permission, even though my parents weren't there,
mm,
so that's the best thing to do for me. But it was a horrible, horrible procedure, and caused a great deal of upset, physical discomfort,
mm,
walking around, learning, literally learning, because it was a very high amputation.
mm,
So literally learning to walk again, 14, 15 years old, was very difficult.
mm,
And I was very bitter and for many years, very, very angry. Why me? Why did it have to happen to me? Why couldn't it have happened to somebody else? Why did it have to happen to me? And I think part of the thing we looked at earlier was that at 14, it's a horrible time for it to happen. But
Mm.
also, it was happening in 1966 when just over the hill from King's College Hospital, only a few miles up the road, swinging London was happening, and
Mm.
everybody was dancing with Judy Christie and going to nightclubs with the Rolling Stones, and I was stuck at the limb fitting centre in Roehampton and unable to get out. So this would be pre-internet. There was very little to occupy you really. I read a lot. I mean, I read a lot of books and as I said earlier, music papers. But it was it was a defining moment of my life, and I'm just very grateful that I survived. I
Yeah.
mean, my wife, bless her, she put up with a lot of my anger for
Mm.
around the anniversary of my amputation. And at one point she said, if it hadn't happened, you could be dead. And I
Mm.
said, well, yeah, but, being as ever gracious as ever. And she said, no, you could have died.
Mm.
We wouldn't have been able to go to Italy. You would have missed the last Bob Dylan album. You went to his long list of things, and I went, yeah, okay, well, fair enough. Actually, yeah, I'm glad I'm still here. At the time, it 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 still haunts me in a way.
Is there
That
something that, Patrick, I wonder, is there something that, because I think many people who may be watching this may well be quite inspired by that despite that huge physical, emotional, all the rest of it challenge, that you went on to have the kind of career that many people would actually, let's be honest with it,
yes, yes,
dream would
yes,
absolutely dream about.
yes,
And
yes.
you talked about how at some moments there's the thing about confidence, but many people might be watching this thinking, oh my goodness, but how on earth did you find the confidence to decide I want to go after this career, being a music journalist, including
Yes.
traveling around the world, given the amputation, given the cats, given those setbacks? How did you, how, where did you find that courage, if courage is the word, from to decide, actually, I'm going to go after this?
Well, I think it was just what you did in a way. I mean, really, um, I had to go to Roehampton, the limb fitting centre, to learn how to walk again. And when I was there were these, this is 1966, there were these guys who'd lost their limbs on the Somme in 1916. They were old people. And I was very conscious of my youth. And I always, my big thing, my overriding memory of the period is that I was different from everybody else because I
Mm,
walked funny. I mean, and I think at that age, you think people are always looking for any sort of chink in your armor in a way. And of course, half of you as a teenager wants to be wants to be different and wants to be
mm,
rebellious. But my difference was the fact that I walked in a funny way, and I had this great clunking metal thing I had to carry around with me. But I mean that was sort of that was my life. I mean there was no other option really. It wasn't. I don't consider myself being particularly brave about it. I just couldn't really see any other option.
mm,
But,
mm.
to,
I
to
mean,
carry
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think that, did you ever find that in your interviewing process with meeting stars, how did they respond to you? Because I guess that one of the things, I mean, for any of us, isn't it, that when we're going into a room with stars, we become very conscious of ourselves. It could be where we're from, our
yes,
gender,
yes,
our ethnicity,
yes.
and so on. Were the moments where there was a conscious dynamic about that in the room? Because of people, it's interesting, going back to what you said about physical disability, isn't it? We still as a society really do struggle with it, isn't it? We're often uncomfortable, we're unsure, we're
Yes,
uncertain, we
yes,
don't
yes.
speak to people and perhaps we should. What's your experience there with
Well, it was for when I learned to walk again, I'd go around on an artificial leg,
yeah.
and then it got to a point where it was very heavy to carry it round. It was putting an unbearable strain on my good knee. So I stopped wearing my artificial leg, and I'd go around on crutches.
Mm,
And so it was manifest that I only had one leg.
mm,
And of course, I'd literally bump into people, and they'd say, "Oh my God, what's happened to you?" Thinking that it had been a recent, tragedy. And that's all. No, this was, I've always worn an artificial leg. And I remember I was doing quite a lot for BBC at the time, and I went up on my crutches for the first time to the BBC, and I was convinced everybody's looking at me. I was convinced everybody looking. Eventually bumped into an old colleague coming out the lift, and John took us. I said, "Dear boy, there appears to be less of you than usual." And I said, "Yeah, well, I'm just managing this." And after that, I kind of thought, well, actually, I mean, this is who I am. This is how I get around.
Mm,
Um, then I wasn't aware I mean, I have to say that things have got so much better
mm,
in the
mm, mm,
disabled community since all
mm,
those years ago when blue badges,
mm,
pavements, the cambered pavements, everything. Um, I was never. I'm not a great disabled activist. I think things have got a lot better, and I go along with that. I'm conscious that, and I was far more conscious then of my disability. And as I said earlier, I felt that's what defined me, that people saw me as
mm,
somebody who's disabled. And bless her, my wife said, no, no, you're a writer who happens to be disabled. And once that seed had been planted, then that actually
mm,
gave me a confidence that
mm.
I hadn't had for a long time.
Wow. I mean, Patrick, I mean, I mean, I could carry on talking to you for absolutely ages. I want to, first of all, just thank you for spending this time with me talking a
No,
bit
thank
about the
you.
book, about music, about your journey. For people, again, who want, we'll put it below the video, but for people who are wanting to find, let's just wave the book one more time,
Oh, okay. Yes.
shall we? So
Why
we can
not?
see the
Yeah.
beautiful cover.
That's 2 years of my life, so it's worth having a look at. Yeah.
Absolutely. So
Um,
Patrick Humphries, but with the Beatles, and you said people can get that via.
there's a if you put a link on there, if you
Yeah,
put a link on the website, they can go direct to the publishers. They'll get
wonderful.
they'll buy a copy of the book. They'll get a signed bookplate with a unique Beatle lyric to
Fantastic.
it, and at some point we may organise a competition to see who if there's any duplicates. But at the moment they're just going out there, and no,
Fantastic.
it's been great. It's been really nice. It's
Patrick, what we'll also do is that we'll find a link to your website, which I'm
yeah,
sure
yeah,
where
that's
people can find out more about you. But but just very huge thanks. But one last question I will ask you before we close, which I don't think I've asked people before, but I'll ask you: is there anything that you would have liked me to have asked you, or anything else that you'd like to say or share with the audience that
oh,
perhaps
that's a very good
hasn't been?
question, isn't it?
Yeah, anything else you'd like to share, or yeah.
Oh God, how long have we got? I know. I mean, I think I've always been fairly candid. I'm just trying to think. I mean, there's the bucket list that you have, that things
Mm,
you've done, places you wish
mm,
you'd been. No, I can't think of
yeah.
anything that.
Is there something that then, Patrick, you would say to? I mean, maybe I just maybe want to think back to the classic one. Perhaps the young person now, the young Patrick or Patricia or whoever, Joe, Joanna, anywhere, and they've heard your story, and there's something that they want to do. Maybe they want to be a journalist, music journalist too. Maybe they want to do something. Maybe they've also had their own setback. It
Hmm.
might be physical, it might be something else. What from your story what would you say to them? Because it can be tough and very, very daunting, isn't it, when there's something that you want to go after, especially
Yes,
in the era that we find ourselves now. What encouragement, and let's not face it, the thing that brought us together, writing in itself, isn't it, of
yes,
something like that, but it's not
yes, yes,
easy. These are tough things, all of these things, isn't it?
yes.
Music, writing, publishing, they're tough industries. What would your advice be to somebody who's perhaps starting out and they've been perhaps inspired by some of the things that you've done?
Well, I think I'm afraid you sort of descend into cliche, really. It's if you've got a dream, follow it. I mean, it is. I think if you believe you can do something, then why not have a go? I think we all have this terrible feeling of potential rejection, and this goes back to the girlfriend or the girl at the dance in 1966. You wish you plucked up courage to go up and ask her to dine, you never did, and the girl you wish you all these stories that you never quite got. It doesn't do any harm to try, it doesn't do any harm to ask, and it doesn't do any harm to just have a go at something you think you might be good at. And I think the world has moved on so exponentially since I was young. in theory, the world literally is your oyster. With what we're talking on, with what's on our computers, you can do anything, and you can write, and God willing, that will be heard somewhere. I think you have to. I do think you have to believe in yourself, and not be knocked back. I mean, you just carry on. I mean, there's no reason not to. What else do you do if you don't carry on?
I like that. I mean, Patrick, I think that one thing I've learned about music journalism is that that clearly must be the last word there. Patrick, I just want to thank you so much. It's been such a joy. We'll put the details of the book. I've just thoroughly enjoyed myself. I've gone over, I think, the golden hour mark where I almost never, I think that you can count the interviews where I've gone over an hour or been perilously close to it, but it's been such a pleasure to speak to you. And I look forward to our next chats.
Yeah, we're due a meeting later this month. No, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed it, and it's teased some things out of me that I've never really spoken about, and it's been I mean, I do hate the phrase, but it has been an interesting journey.
Fantastic, and we look forward to your memoir. I, for one, will
Yeah,
definitely enjoy reading it, and I
yeah.
think
I've got a rough draft that I've completed. I've got a. I Fun enough, I had a lunch with a friend who's very good at pitching ideas to various people, and he's given me some ideas about what the unique selling point is. So I'm going to go back and redraft that. So hopefully
and
somewhere down the line we'll come back again, and
absolutely,
I'll
and
be
we'll
able
have
to
to
hold
get a
up a
copy of
copy
it
of.
to Paul. We'll have to get a copy of it to Paul. You're going to be in a better position
Yeah.
to get that copy to him than me.
Yeah. But he never writes, he never calls, he's like he's
Well, until next time, Patrick.
Thank you.
Patrick,
No, it's
such a
great. So thank you so much.